and welcome to Beyond the Knife, a medical history podcast brought to you by Surgeons Hall, Museums, Library and Archives. We are part of the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh. I am Chanté, Director of Heritage and Estates at the college. Each episode, I'm joined by a guest who shares a story from the history of medicine and surgery. This episode contains discussions on topics that some people may find distressing. Please take care while listening. Medical jurisprudence, or the link between medicine and law, started to flourish in the 1800s. Many collections, like the one here at Surgeons Hall, show how, as our understanding of the human body advanced, and fields like forensic toxicology emerged, doctors and surgeons helped shape the role of medical expertise in both solving crime and supporting legal decisions. Today, medical jurisprudence includes many specialities that combine science and law, and thanks to popular shows like CSI, Bones and Dexter, many of us have become absolutely fascinated by this field. But beyond the screen, what is it really like to work in a field where science meets justice, and where death is often part of the job? In this episode, we're joined by Dame Sue Black, world-renowned professor of anatomy and one of the UK's leading forensic anthropologists, to explore the truth behind the fiction and discover what it really means to work in medical jurisprudence today. Sue, welcome to the podcast. We'd like to start out with a warm-up question that we ask all our guests. So if you could be present at any moment in the history of medicine, what would it be and why?
Oh, I think I would want to be the very first person who was given a scalpel to cut into a human body. So, I need to be way before Vesalius, right back in the beginning, where the first person thought it's okay to look inside somebody's body.
Gosh, that would have been an incredible moment, huh? Like, what is in here?
I'm a great believer that anatomy is almost the first science, because the human is just such a narcissistic primate that, wanting to know what we look like both inside and out. I reckon whoever took that first scalpel or sharp blade to somebody's torso, that's who I'd want to be.
The first knife to skin.
Yeah, that's the one. I do want the patient to be dead. I need to state that I have no desire to cut into human tissue whilst the person is a threat in terms to their life. So I do need my patients dead.
So a pure scientific endeavor.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So you're talking to us today about forensic anthropology. Tell us, what is forensic anthropology?
Okay, but the easiest thing to do is to separate that out into two words. So if we take the first word, which was the forensic bit, we're anatomists, we love a bit of Latin. So that comes from the word forensis, which means pertaining to the forum. And the forum were the courts of Rome. It's the open areas of debate, and it was where the laws were heard. So forensic means pertaining to the court. People think if it's forensic, it's to do with the police and it's to do with investigation. It isn't. It's about being an expert witness to the court. And then to confuse it all, take a bit of Latin and put a bit of Greek in, so that the anthropology is, of course, Greek, which means the study of the human. So it's the study of the human for the purposes of the court.
Gosh, and that's different to pathology.
Yeah, so a forensic pathologist, many things they do, but the very clear difference between us is a forensic anthropologist in the UK is generally not medically qualified. We tend to be scientists. And so we are not permitted to give an opinion on either a manner of death or a cause of death, because that's a certified process. And so you need to be medically qualified to do that. So our job primarily is about identification, but the pathologist is about the manner and the cause of death.
So some of the key tenets of forensic anthropology, you've already said it, anatomy.
Yes, absolutely. It comes down to anatomy every time. I think in later years, people tended to spend more or give more of a focus on forensic anthropology to bones, so to the osteology. But of course, it's so much more than that, because you can't understand the bones unless you know the muscles and the tendons and the joints and the nerves and the arteries. And by the time you're into that, you're in no other field other than anatomy. So a really sound understanding of the soft tissue helps you to understand the hard tissue. And of course, we're not just about bones. So a lot of the work that I do, for example, is in dismemberment or identification of the living. So it really is, from our perspective, any aspect that requires interrogation of the human body, but not to the point of assigning a cause or a manner of death.
And so you are a trained anatomist to start?
I am, yeah. So my very first um, experience in university where I felt I belonged was the day that I walked into the dissecting room in Aberdeen University. Up until that point, I'd done a couple of years of things like genetics, and I'd never really understood why anybody cared whether fruit flies had round bottoms or pointed bottoms. It was just beyond me. I never understood why anybody wanted to dig a hole and look at the layers of soil. So soil science was not for me. Psychology, I never wanted to get inside people's heads. Thank you very much indeed. So by the end of the second year, I really didn't know why I was in university and what I was going to do. And the two things I was any good at was anatomy because I looked down microscopes, but I really don't like microscopes either. And I was either going to be an anatomist or a botanist. And I went to speak to the botanist, and he, bless him, was the most boring man on the planet. And I thought, well, I don't want to be him, so I'm not going to be a botanist. And when I spoke to the anatomist, what she told me was, you'll go into the dissecting room, you'll be given a human cadaver, and your job is to dissect that body for an entire year. And my job growing up as a teenager was in a butcher shop. And I knew I could cut into muscle and I could cut bone. That kind of stuff was absolutely fine for me. So I thought, I'll become an anatomist. I don't think I ever quite really knew what that meant. But when I stepped that day over the Rubicon into a dissecting room, I knew I belonged. That was where I belonged, was in a dissecting room. And I, in my naivety, thought, how can it take a year to dissect a human body? We can do it in a day. And of course, the reality is it takes 10 years and more to be able to understand anatomy. And one could argue probably never fully understand it. So I just immersed myself. I lost myself in anatomy. And whatever else I went on to do, at my core, I'm a human anatomist.
You've written two books, Sue, Written in Bone and All That Remains. And in those books, you talk about absolutely anatomy and how that is key to the work that you do. But you also talk about embryology, and you use a wonderful phrase called reverse engineering a body, which I absolutely loved. Can you tell us more about that?
So it's really the fact that, when we think about anatomy, we think about it in terms of gross understanding. So it's being able to look at the muscles and the joints and such things. But the reality is that, when you start to focus on anatomy, the areas just get smaller and smaller and smaller. So that, before you know it, you're looking down a microscope. And a microscope isn't enough. You need to look down an electron microscope. You need to get down to the molecular level and genes and such things. So in many ways, it's going to the smallest little parcel of the human and rebuilding from that as much as we can to get the overall picture of the person. So reverse engineering from the smallest little parcel right up to the complex organism that you are. And you never know in a forensic case what you're going to be given. It might just be a fragment of bone. It might be just a piece of tooth. It could be an X-ray. It could be anything. And so you need to understand the human body in every single format in which it might appear. Now, I'm not an expert in genetics, as I've just told you, but I know people who are. But I have to understand enough to be able to know the features that I look for in identification on the hand. How many of those have got an inheritance pattern to them? How many have a genetic predisposition? So it's a wonderful subject that is so gloriously broad, but also so very precise and small at the same time.
Gosh, that's incredible. One of the things that really struck me as well is that work to identify who the person was, and by doing that, how they lived their life. So how you can see somebody's life and what they ate, what they did, written in their body afterwards. And you talk about tattoos, for example, and being able to identify, even if the tattoo isn't visible, that someone might have had a tattoo.
So what we knew in the dissecting room, usually from elderly gentlemen who would have anchors and mother and such things tattooed on their forearm, that we would learn in the dissecting room, when you looked at the lymph nodes that drain that part of skin, those lymph nodes take on the color of the tattoo. So these old men had these sort of blue-green sort of lymph nodes. And it didn't appear in the groin region. It didn't appear in any other part of the body because it's just draining the skin from that region. And so we realized that there was a possibility that you could determine the presence of tattoos even if you don't have the limbs. Now, you can't tell what the pattern is, of course you can't, but you can tell what colors the tattoo were. So that nowadays tattoos are multicolored, and so are your lymph nodes. So if you've got red tattoos and yellow tattoos, your lymph nodes will become multicolored as well. Now, there's no suggestion that that does any impairment to your lymph nodes at all. It's just they become pretty colors, the same as your tattoos. And we thought, well, that's useful. You never know when it's going to be useful, but it could be useful. And it has been in cases that we've done.
So, thinking about that application of forensic anthropology, in All That Remains, you share some truly remarkable stories of your time spent in Kosovo. And just for listeners who may need some additional context, in Kosovo, from 1998 to 99, there was a very, very violent uprising, and that was between the Albanian communities and the Serb minority backed by the Yugoslav government. And so you led the British forensic team sent by the FCO under the banner of the United Nations. What made your skills, your experience so relevant, so important at that time and in that place?
So I led the forensic anthropology part of it. The teams were very much Foreign Office-based teams, and the lead for the team was always a senior police officer. So that was incredibly important. But what we had was this multifaceted team. And I got a phone call one afternoon from a forensic pathologist in Glasgow, Peter Vanessas. And Peter said to me, "What are you doing on Saturday, Suze?" And I thought, that's really nice. He's going to ask me to dinner. And he wasn't. He was saying, if you're not doing anything, then we want you on a plane because we'd like you out to Kosovo. And like everybody else, I think I had watched the news and had some idea of what was happening in that part of the world. But suddenly, when you think you're going to go there, you become like a sponge and you go away and you research what you're going into. And what they had was the British forensic team was one of the first teams to go in. And they came to a particular scene, and it was an outhouse. And 44 men had been taken off the refugee line that was heading down towards Albania. And they'd been taken to this outhouse, separated into two rooms. A gunman had stood at the door of each room and sprayed the room with Kalashnikov gunfire. Um, the accomplices then stood at the window. They threw in straw, they threw in petrol, and they torched the building. So that when we come along 9 months later or so, what we have are bodies that are badly decomposed because it's the heat of summer. They're piled on top of each other like human Jenga in some ways. They're partly burnt, they're partly buried under roof tiles, and the packs of roaming dogs have seen it as a food source, so they're disturbed. So the pathologist had stood at the door of the outhouse and said, "I have no idea how we're going to do this, but I know someone who will." And that was the phone call that I took. And so I went out there really not knowing what to expect. I'd been a forensic anthropologist who'd worked on cases with, one or maybe two deceased at the most. But to be faced with a room full of, well, 43, because one person had survived, deceased, was a whole new experience. And you learned it on the ground with everybody else because nobody in the team had done that. It was such an enlightening time for me because it allowed me to bring my science to a real world problem where we could try to make a difference, and a difference on two levels. So one was about bringing the perpetrators of those crimes to justice, and that's why the International Criminal Court was there. And the other was about the families that would be there as we cleared these sites. They wanted their sons or their daughters, their mothers, their fathers, they wanted their bodies back. And part of our job was to identify who they were to try and let those families gain some kind of closure. So it was a really powerful application of anatomy and forensic anthropology as a result of it into an immediacy of a world problem. And that's such a privilege, such a huge and inordinate privilege.
So you're doing two things. You are collecting evidence that can be used in a criminal trial, and you're identifying people so that they can be returned to their families.
So primarily, we were there under the auspices of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and they were responding to a request from the International Criminal Tribunal for gratis forensic teams. So primarily,
Mm.
Our requirement was to find evidence, recover the evidence, analyze the evidence, and present the evidence. The fact that in doing that, we could help to identify the individuals gave us what was a secondary purpose, which was the return of bodies. Now, once the ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, had got all the indictment sites that they needed, they felt they had enough evidence to take Milosevic and Karadzic and Mladic and others to trial. There was no longer any need for the forensic side of things. And so from about 2001 onwards, what we were doing was humanitarian. It was solely about repatriation, recovery and repatriation, because there was no need for any more forensic involvement.
Mm. And so you've done a lot of work to establish standards around human identification. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I think, you know, in when we look at our past, and I am writing the third book, I promised my publishers,
Yay!
no, I promised my publishers I'd write three books. And I wrote the first one and liked it, wrote the second one and hated it, and just tried really hard not to even think about the third one. So I've actually had to do it now. So I'm in the process of that. And it's allowed me to go back and think about how forensic science has developed. And by and large, much of the forensic science that we use now, if you take out DNA, because that's really much, much later, most of it was around at the end of the 1800s. People were looking at fingerprints, they were looking at faces, they were looking at footprints. And at the time, a lot of those sciences weren't developing were scientists. They were being driven by police who had a need that they needed to meet. There wasn't a whole lot of science behind fingerprints. It was fundamentally taking two images and been like that game that you play as a child where you spot the differences between the two pictures. It really wasn't more than that. It wasn't a science. It only becomes a science when you understand the probability and the likelihood, and you can understand variation. So that came in time. And I think in my discipline, it was the same because people brought in the anatomists when they needed a little bit of help. It wasn't that anatomy was a forensic subject that was really trailblazing. You were helping out the police when they needed it. And the result was that there wasn't a lot of standards. So when you look at the standards, we didn't have any. We were just helping out the police. And that isn't good enough in this day and age. We need to have the protocols and the procedures that we can prove that we have followed the best practice that we could. And so for forensic anthropology, I looked for where could our professional body be. And it wasn't within the Anatomical Society because the Anatomical Society had moved much more into genetics and cellular and those sorts of things that just weren't our field. And so really it belonged with anthropology. And so the Royal Anthropological Institute became our professional body. We set up a process of certification. So we now have chartered forensic anthropologists, which means you have to sit the exams that prove you understand not only your subject, but the law as it pertains to your subject. You need to prove that you keep up continued professional development to show that you stay current within your discipline. And you need to mentor those who are coming behind you because they need to have that formal process of being able to know that there's somebody who is going to be there for them when, you know, they face the difficulties that you faced at the outset.
And so all of this is remarkably recent, isn't it?
It is recent, insofar as really we started working with the Royal Anthropological Institute pretty much around the time of Kosovo. So we're in the early parts of the 2000s. But when
Mm.
you think that, you know, anatomy has been used since, you know, Adam was a boy, quite frankly, and has assisted in these cases, it has been terribly ad hoc. And the chances are that, unfortunately, what you do get are people who are hobbyists. So they will call themselves forensic something or another. And that may mean they've never done a case in their life. And when we go into the courtroom, we're there as expert witnesses. So we need to be experts. We need to prove we're experts because the real prize at the end of the day is somebody's freedom or it's somebody's life. If you're in a country that has a death penalty, then the evidence that you give has a huge impact on not just one person's life, but the victims' families' lives, the person who's accused, the people who are the family of the accused. All of those are impacted by this case. And we really need to prove that we know what we're talking about. We can't afford to be cowboys.
It's such a good point as well, though, in terms of the history of forensics in the criminal justice system. So staying still with that application of forensic anthropology. So, and there are some amazing historical cases. And one I've heard you talk about is the mid 1800s. I think it's 1849, and at the Harvard case. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So that was a very early case where the anatomists were brought in. And it was about somebody who went missing and there had been an altercation. And eventually, in the basement of the anatomy department, of course, they found parts of the dismembered body. So, we would make terrific criminals being anatomists and forensic anthropologists. I couldn't kill somebody, but my goodness me, could I dismember them and hide the parts? So, we'd make great partnership. And I think Richard Osman very recently in one of his podcasts said when he was writing his crime books, if he wanted to kill someone, then he'd partner up with me. Because at least I could do that half of the job, and he reckoned he could do the other half. So the anatomy was a really logical place to go looking for the body. And the anatomists who were brought in and the anthropologists could identify the fragments of the body and the fragments of the teeth as belonging to this individual. Now, these are in days long before DNA, long before. And you have to say, well, just how reliable were these techniques? And the answer is not foolproof, that's for sure. DNA has certainly improved our confidence in identification. But still in all, the anatomists were able to do it. But in this country, the case of Buck Ruxton, who was the medic in Lancaster, who killed both his common law wife and their maid, he did much the same thing. And they were murdered, they were dismembered. He was a surgeon, he knew how to do this. It's always in the bath, let's face it. The bath is a wonderful place to dismember a body. It's body sized, it has water, it takes all the nasty stuff away down the drains. And then what he did was he put their body parts into the car, took them across the border into Scotland, and threw them over the bridge into a fast flowing river at Moffat. When the body parts were found, what then happened was utterly inspirational and unique. And I'm so proud of both the Scottish scientists and the Lancaster police because they worked together on this at a time when nobody thought about it. And they brought the anatomist down from Edinburgh to say, we've got all these parts. How do we bring them together? And so the body parts were taken up to Edinburgh. The Glasgow pathologist, the Edinburgh pathologist, the Edinburgh anatomist worked together, which was almost unheard of in terms of ego at the time. And it was absolutely textbook the way that they did it, piecing the body together, finding the little pieces of identification that were specific to each of the women. Because one of the things Buck Ruxton had done was to remove the parts that he felt were identifiable. And of course, in removing them, what you create is a negative of the situation. Why would you remove that? Because she had a birthmark there, because she had a scar there. And so their absence, in many ways, he reflected by the things that he chose to remove. But entomology was brought in for the first time. How long had these body parts been in there? Being able to use dermal fingerprints to reconstruct the epidermal fingerprints, because of course the outer layer of skin had all come off in the water. That had never been done before. And then the incredible thing of superimposing Isabella Ruxton's skull onto a photograph to be able to show just how perfectly they matched was inspirational. So although, I give credit to the American case as being one of the first, I think one of the best that was the first was done in that combination between the Scottish scientists and the Lancaster police.
It's such an amazing example as well. And you've got this, I love how you say this overcoming of egos. It's a really great point that there's a recognition of a problem and the need to bring in people to help you solve it. And it's a bit like your colleague with Kosovo, right? This understanding of we need help. But then also just this wonderful problem solving, right? And all of the new discoveries that come through solving incredibly complex problems. What really struck me, though, as well in reading your books was the need to be able to communicate quite complex things in a courtroom. So, how you take all that scientific information and you communicate it to a jury. Now, so you have been an expert witness, you will be an expert witness again. What's that like?
Awful, absolutely awful, especially if the defense, Casey as they are now, is Donald Finlay. Can I just say, my absolute and utter nemesis in the courtroom, but a very dear friend, but not that you would know it in the courtroom because he's so utterly professional. And, when I walk into the courtroom and I see Donald, my heart sinks. My heart sinks because I know this is going to be a tough afternoon. And so it should be, because that's the whole point of the defense, is to challenge you in court. And if they don't challenge you, they're not doing their job. So we know it's coming. And that's what my third book is about. It's about what is it like to be an expert witness. And so there are two things going on in the courtroom. There is the fact that you have to answer the questions that the legal team are asking you, and some of them are very challenging. But you have to be able to do it in a way that is understandable to everybody in the room. Because the most important people in the room are the jury. They're the ones who are there to try the facts. And they're the only ones who will decide on the guilt or the innocence of the individual. And I cut my teeth on public speaking when I was much younger academic, and I got onto the circuit of doing the Women's Institute, and touring around all these sort of little halls and such things in the back of Beyond, telling stories. And that ability to tell a story, but to still get across what's important, I think came from my father, because my father was a great storyteller. And his mother, my grandmother, was an absolute legend of a storyteller. So I like to think there's a sort of genetic learning that's come down through time. But whereas my grandmother made up many of her stories, we're not allowed to. So our stories have to be very factually correct, but to use language that isn't jargon, to make people be able to understand what's important and what isn't. And I know that when we go into the courtroom, many of the public think that what's going to happen is what you see in CSI or a silent witness. And we are such an absolute and utter disappointment to the entire jury wielding public. Because when we get into the courtroom, we want to talk about probability and likelihood ratios and Bayes' theorem. And the minute you start to talk statistics, you can see the jury just completely glaze over because that's not what they think they're there to hear. So you have to put it into terms of thinking, what does 1 in 100 look like? Well, where would you find 100 people? What does 1 in 1,000 look like? Where would you find? So it's one person in this auditorium or whatever it may be, and creating something that is understandable but is not in any way talking down to somebody, because you will lose the jury if they feel you're being terribly supercilious and you're being very important. You will lose them. They need to know that you're there to try and help them to do their job, and their job is more important than mine.
So, just on that point of CSI, in the public imagination, and I mean, I am absolutely guilty of that. When we think about forensics, we do think about this exciting world of slightly romantic detective work and courtroom dramas. A lot of that, I think you're right too. There's a base in science, but then there's a lot of colouring outside of the lines when it comes to it too. The Here at the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh, there's a letter from Arthur Conan Doyle that he wrote to his professor Joseph Bell, crediting him for the inspiration for Sherlock Holmes and for informing the stories of Sherlock Holmes, which I think Joseph Bell loved, but also recognised those stories were quite different from what happened in reality. What do you think about that, though? How this is portrayed in the media? And is that something we need to work more to demystify?
It's a really interesting question that probably needs about 5 hours to unpack, but I'm not going to do that. You'll be delighted to know. I think Conan Doyle has a huge amount to answer for, quite frankly. He wrote the most amazing books for the time that simply captured the imagination of the public and the press. I mean, it was just the very fact that they're still being read, that we're still producing television programs, we're still producing films, shows just what a character it was he created. And although it was fiction, there was enough fact in it that made it feel real. And that's the real skill of not making it all fact so that's utterly boring, but not making it all fiction so that it's unbelievable. And he did that incredibly well. But what it did was it really got the imagination of the public who thought now they understand this science because Sherlock Holmes says this is what you can do. And all the real scientists pulled their hair out and went, no, that's not what we do at all. There's an element of truth in it, but we can't do it with such gay abandon in many ways as Sherlock Holmes did. And if you know, Sherlock Holmes never went into the courtroom. So he was never tested under cross-examination. I don't think he would have survived under Donald Finlay, quite frankly. And you know, if I could take a moment in time and create a fictitious situation that I'd love to have front row for, it would be Sherlock Holmes in the witness box being cross-examined by Donald Finlay. How
Oh, that
wonderful that would be.
that is a fantastic idea, right? So you do a lot of work, though, public engagement work to talk about the reality of forensic anthropology or forensics and the importance of that reality. And in terms of or the public response to that, I feel that people love that as well. They love to hear the truth of how it really works too.
They do, but they don't want too much of the truth because they're not scientists. If you think most of our jury probably haven't studied any science since they were in school. And so it's really important for us to talk our science at the level of senior high school. And if it's going beyond that into areas that are really challenging, we have to do instruction. So we have to be teachers as well as communicators. And those are two quite different things. It's easy to communicate the stories, but when you have to teach it as well in the courtroom, that's a challenge, knowing just how much detail is needed and how much isn't. And what I love is when we do public engagement, that we take that reality in. So we've done a number of occasions where we've taken a case into a fictitious courtroom and we have the jury there and we're instructing them on all the information and they're making a decision. That really creates an electricity because there's a truth in that. It's not a passive understanding, it's an active involvement. And I think afterwards, when we talk to people and they say, oh God, no, I really loved being involved in that because it made me think differently. When I watch the television programs, I soak it in like a sponge, but it doesn't really impact on me. But when you put me into that position of responsibility to make a decision, I realized I needed to understand something more than I already did. And I realized that what I thought I knew from television wasn't true at all. And I love that moment where the reality and the television suddenly reach a threshold. And those thresholds, I think, are magical places. When Alan Alda came over and opened our research centre in Dundee, he said something that stuck with me. He said, you know, actors understand the importance of a threshold. Columbo did it, Vera did it. You know, as they're going out the room, they stop and they turn and they ask the killer question on the threshold. And wherever you have that threshold where two worlds collide, I think something magical happens in there. And that's the bit that I like to get to with public engagement.
Wow, yeah, that's wonderful. Um, so, just within CSI, within all the storytelling, there's this new technology, new science. So, in reality, thinking about the world today, things like the climate change, the climate crisis, the event AI, all these things must put impact on your work.
They do. I mean, climate crisis, you think about immigration, for example. So people fleeing countries, not just because of war, but because of adversities that are food loss or safety loss or water loss or whatever it may be. So part of our work is looking at individuals who come into the country, either legally or illegally. And the question is asked because we have a legal system, are they adults or are they children? If they are a child, then because we've signed up to the international rights of the child, then it is our duty to ensure that child is safe, that they are educated, they are fed, they are warm, and we must treat them as a child. Now, it would be very easy to say, well, let's just treat everyone as a child, it will be fine. And you can't do that because we have to create a safe environment for people who are genuinely children. So somebody who comes into the country and says they're a child, but in fact they are an adult, if we misage them and we determine they're a child, we're placing an adult into an environment with vulnerable young people. And there's a potential then for grooming and exploitation. So that age estimation is really important. And it got quite a lot of press when the Rwanda bill and such things were going through, because it was, well, why? Why do we do this? Why don't we just let people in? Because actually, we have to protect those who are genuinely children. And adults in our legal system are dealt with in a different way. And so we have to abide by our legal system. So, what the Home Office wanted us to do was they wanted us to be able to say quite specifically this individual is 16 years, 3 months, 2 days, 5 hours, and 30 seconds old, which of course we can't do. And we told the government that what they were doing was they were asking the wrong question. The question isn't how old is the individual? The question is, could the individual be the age that they claim to be? Because not everybody knows how old they are. Not everybody has certification. And so we turned it, as scientists, we turned it on its head and said, this is a much fairer way. So we could have a real impact on helping those who don't know their age but could well be children. And so that felt a really important use of our science to a modern situation. AI terrifies the living daylights out of me. I just read a report from the Internet Watch Foundation, the IWF, just the other day, that the level of AI produced child sexual abuse has risen by 380%. So people are generating these images online. And of course, there are people who say, well, isn't that safer? Because these aren't real. But what you need to understand is that people can stitch the face of somebody they want onto these offensive images. And what we're finding is that a lot of family members are choosing to do that. Now that's a concern, because at what point then does that tip over into being actual child abuse? And AI is facilitating that in some ways. The courtroom isn't ready to deal with AI yet. It's barely coping with digital and trying to understand what is fake and what is real in the digital world rather than something that is generated by artificial intelligence. There's a huge problem coming our way, a really big juggernaut.
Gosh, that is terrifying, isn't it? So, in terms of your work as a forensic anthropologist and the work that you do to think about standards, to think about how we might approach challenges like that, what can you do with that problem looming?
Wish I knew is the honest truth. I wish I knew. It's about trying to keep as far ahead of it as we possibly can, but not forgetting what our purpose is. Our purpose is to find evidence, recover evidence, analyze it, and present it. And we can only do it to the level that we can manage with the technology that we currently have. If you take the difference between pre-DNA days and post-DNA days, pre-DNA, before, Alec Jeffreys was sitting in his lab in Leicester, pulling his hair out, couldn't get his medical experiments to work, couldn't figure out why. And it was simply because he had that eureka moment that everybody's DNA is different. What a step change that was. And we translated that into the forensic world. And now, it's a very different post DNA world than it was pre DNA. And my area in the field actually straddled that. So the first cases that I was involved in, we didn't have DNA. And so as the anatomist and the anthropologist, you were doing the best you could with the technology you had, which probably hadn't changed since the 1800s. Now, when DNA came in, our casework shifted enormously. So all the simple cases where identification could be done with DNA were off our docket. We didn't have to deal with those anymore. We were dealing with the much more complex cases where DNA couldn't solve the problem. And that's going to come back to us, I think, in the digital world And in the AI world, there's going to say, we can't tell whether this is real or not. Who knows what a real body looks like? And the answer is the anatomist.
Gosh. Um, so, just to wrap up, I wanted to touch on some of the more philosophical points that you raise in particularly your book, All That Remains. The You talk about the societal taboos around death, but also your work, which is, of course, surrounded by death. Well, the dead, really. And I've been in this role for about a year, and I've never worked so closely with human remains collections. And it is, I feel myself changing, and I feel myself, for the first time, being very grateful for the very healthy body I have. Whereas in the past, I was always like, my thighs are too big. This is too, the arms are too big. And I'm like, I'm so pleased you work and you walk around, and it's great. Can you tell us a little bit about how your work with the dead, with dead people, has really changed how you think about life, how you think about legacy, and death too?
So I'm going to take you back to when I was very little and the most important person in my life. My grandmother was the most important person in my life. I loved my mother and father, but my grandmother was my best friend. And she came from the west coast of Scotland. And she was a good old-fashioned tuchter in that she believed in a life beyond this and the spirits and all sorts of things. And she used to say to me as a child, you've got to understand that death walks beside you every moment of your life. And at some point or another, your paths will cross. You may be in your 80s, but you might be in your 20s. And if death's going to walk alongside you, wouldn't it be a good idea to make them a friend? Because who'd want to walk alongside an enemy all your life? And because she was born in the 1800s, it would have been totally improper for her to have a friend who was a man. So death was always a woman. So she would always refer to she as being death. And somehow growing up, that took away some of the fear and the sting because in making it feminine, it was softer, it was more compassionate. And we would have long conversations about her good friend death and what it meant and what happened at the end. I mean, she had a different idea of what happened to what I believe, but it meant I grew up not feeling at all afraid or having any misconceptions about what death meant. It was as important as birth, but one was a beginning and one was an end, and that was the end of it as far as I was concerned. So when I came into the butcher shop, which was about dead animals, when I came into the anatomy department, which was about dead humans, and I continued that into the forensic world, death was always there. But she's always been there anyway, because she's always been a part of my life. And I've always talked to my daughters very openly and honestly about what it means to die. They have the full list of what I intend to happen on my death, and which, doesn't surprise them at all because it's always been there for me. So I don't know that my job has influenced me or changed me in my attitude to death because I think it was always there. What it has done, though, is it has changed my attitude to life. And Kosovo did that probably more than anywhere else. When you stood at a graveside with a woman who had lost everything, she'd lost her home, she'd lost all her belongings. Her husband and her sons had been murdered. Her daughters had been taken away and raped until they died. She's standing at the graveside with nothing, but she will still come up to you and bring you a cup of coffee because there is that spark of humanity in there that just transcends all of the horrors that the world can do. That moment reminds you that life is important. You can't do anything for the dead who have gone other than your best, but it's the living that matter. And I went home from Kosovo, and my daughters never went a night without a story before they went to bed, without a song before they went to bed, without the cuddle, without the kiss, without them knowing and being told they were loved, because that woman could no longer do that to her family. So it taught me what was important. My girls were the most important thing in my life. I didn't care if the car had a scratch. I didn't care if the carpet didn't get hoovered. It made no difference whatsoever. And like you, I stopped caring what other people thought about me and stopped caring about what I looked like. Every morning when I woke up with a pulse, I was winning.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Sue.
It's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Knife, a medical history podcast brought to you by Surgeons Hall Museums, Library and Archives. To find out more about us, you can visit www.museum.rcsed.ac.uk. You can also follow us on our social media channels. Join us wherever you get your podcasts.